All right, thanks a lot. So, what is science good for? Well, it's great for a lot of things. It's a good reason that science is the dominant means of acquiring knowledge in Western resource management. It provides an agreed-upon methodology with which to test hypotheses and describe the resource that we're concerned with. It can also help make predictions about the future. Sure. Unfortunately, what science can't tell us is how the world should be. This is the difference between description, which science is good at, and prescription, which it cannot do. And it's important to recognize that difference between description and prescription. Anyone trying to claim that any sort of descriptive evidence necessitates a prescription on anything is not being explicit about what sort of normative, value-laden assumptions are underlying that prescription. As an example, this first statement was made by a representative of the British Columbia herring fishery. I'm sorry? Yeah, sorry. There we go. Of the commercial industry here in British Columbia. And it was quoted in a Globe and Mail story that came out last year. Now, the second statement was also quoted in a Globe and Mail article at the same time. This statement comes from a representative of the Heiltsuk Nation. Now, in both these statements, there are some significant normative assumptions being made. But these assumptions aren't being made explicit. You know, the implications about the value of herring, the motives of management, and how much herring should be taken are hidden between the lines. You know, for instance, what is a fishable abundance to the first speaker? And why do these two speakers disagree on the basic facts of the matter? They seem to dispute the validity of the science being used. So when you have this conflation of descriptive and normative ideas, you can create quite a bit of confusion as to what the disagreement here is really all about. Is it the speakers' different perceptions of the reality of the stocks, their descriptive notions, or are there different normative values underlying the preferences of the two speakers? So, welcome to the messy world of British Columbia's herring fisheries. In this talk, I'm going to introduce you to an ongoing political debate in resource management here in British Columbia. I'm going to highlight the positions taken by opposing sides in the debate, and in particular, I'm going to highlight which disagreements arise over descriptive issues of fact and which ones are coming from a disagreement over the values and more normative issues about how the fishery ought to be managed. And then I'm going to give you a little taste of what myself and my supervisors are doing to try to help make this distinction more explicit. So, herring fisheries here in BC can be divided up into three sectors. There's the First Nations food, social, and ceremonial use sector. There's a very small recreational fishery and a fairly large and lucrative commercial fishery. And the three main products that these commercial fisheries produce include a limited amount of food in which they catch the entire herring and process it, bait, which is sold mostly for longline fisheries elsewhere. And then there's the more lucrative roe sacks and spawn on kelp. The sack roe are actually removed from gravid females as they're about to spawn. And the spawn on kelp is harvested from bull kelp usually, where after the herring deposit their eggs upon it. And this is quite a delicacy in Japan and other East Asian countries. Of course, it's also a delicacy amongst traditional First Nations communities here in BC. The spawn on kelp is, to many people, a sort of soul food with deep cultural importance. that has been harvested for millennia. It's also been a source of revenue for many small communities since the late 1970s. However, low stock abundance in recent years has caused the availability of this resource to dry up, and some communities are hurting from the economic impact as well. So, herring is managed in BC by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. Now, DFO recommends management rules each year based upon the results of stock assessments and forecasts that they carry out, as well as from input that they get from the Integrated Herring Harvest Planning Committee, which is a representative board made up of folks from the commercial, recreational, First Nations sectors of the fishery, as well as conservation interests, government representatives as well. They also consult with individual First Nations as required by law and as requested by the First Nations of concern. But at the end of the day, the Minister of Fisheries holds the ultimate authority over any decisions that get made in herring fisheries here in BC. This has had some repercussions and added to a conflict that I'll get into in just a second. This is a representation of just how that decision-making process works, where each year after the fishery takes place, data is collected. This data goes into stock assessment models, which give DFO an assessment of how many fish there are and how much they expect to be there for the next year's fishery. Based upon that, they use a preset rule to determine how much fish can be taken in the next year. Based upon this preliminary recommendation, they go and sit down with the IHHPC and individual First Nations and consult with them whether they feel they're appropriate or not. The DFO then writes their integrated fishery management plan, and the minister finalizes the rules and the fishery takes place. This may or may not involve incorporating any of those suggestions offered by the consultants. And that very issue has resulted in some political battles over the last few years. In 2014 and in 2015, the minister disregarded DFO recommendations and allowed roe fisheries to take place in many areas in which the stock assessments estimated very low biomasses and had a lot of uncertainty around those estimates as well. Now, in 2014, the industry and many First Nations, the Haida Nation and the industry in 2014 reached a sort of gentleman's agreement in which the industry did not fish in their waters, and conflict was avoided. However, in 2015, things became a little bit more tumultuous. The Haida Nation took DFO to court and won an injunction against commercial fishery taking place in their waters. The Heiltsuk Nation weren't as successful in the courts and instead resorted to protest actions, which forced DFO managers' hands locally and closed the fishery, but only after a small seine fishery had already occurred. Now, this year has been a little bit more respectful between the two parties, or the many parties. Haida Gwaii waters remain closed, and the Heiltsuk were able to negotiate a very limited access fishery with requirements such as mandatory observer coverage and area restrictions. So, as I've said, this conflict stems from both issues around the state of the stocks and issues about how the fisheries should be managed. So, we're going to start by looking at some of these descriptive issues of fact. So, many First Nations and many non-DFO scientists have deep concerns with the methods that DFO uses to assess the stocks. Their assumptions that they use to extrapolate from the spawn that herring leave to the amount of recruitment, that is the number of young fish that enter the adult population in the next year, there's a lot of disagreement over whether it's appropriate or not. Non-DFO scientists, claim that DFO is consistently overestimating their estimates and therefore overestimating how much biomass or how many fish there are to catch each year. There's also some controversy over the historic baseline that DFO assumes, with many non-DFO scientists saying that that baseline is way too low as far as DFO assumes it to be, and that this, because fishery rules each year are set by the ratio of that year's biomass to the historical baseline, that therefore they're underestimating the amount of fish that should be in place before the fishery takes place. There's also a lot of disagreement about the spatial structure and the population structure of these fish. Many First Nations and scientists outside of the agency claim that there are these many subpopulations, or stocklets that they call, which, if they existed, would have some serious implications for the way that the fishery is carried out. I'll discuss that in just a second. And finally, what no one can really explain is just why some of the smaller stocks have failed to rebound, despite the fact that no fishing has taken place on those stocks for many, many years. There's obviously some environmental issues or environmental factors that are keeping those populations depressed, which have not yet been fully understood. So here is a shot of what the roe fishery looks like. So you see near shore that white cloud is milt that has been deposited by male herring. And offshore, all of these purse seine vessels are scooping up as many female herring as they possibly can. Now, if these individual stocklets exist, as many DFO, non-DFO scientists and many First Nations claim, then this concentration in a small space by the fishing fleet could have serious consequences on these local populations. And many small communities along the coast have claimed that exactly this sort of concentration has wiped out the local herring stocks that it used to rely on. But in addition, though, to these issues around the science and the state of the herring stocks, there's many normative issues about how the fishery ought to be managed, which I'll dive into next. So, first of all, the model that DFO uses to assess the herring stocks is a single species model. Many non-DFO scientists have issues with this and claim that DFO needs to be using more ecosystem-based modeling to account for the effects of fishing for herring that end up affecting other species that rely on herring for their food. Now, there's also a lot of debate about how the economic benefits of the roe fishery are distributed. Since most of the fishing licenses exist here in the lower mainland, there's a lot of resentment towards that money, the revenue that's gained from fishing local resources is coming all the way back down here. There's also many independent fishers that are upset with the increasing concentration of the quota and licenses into fewer and fewer hands owned by large industry bodies. Now, there's also many non-economic benefits that the fishery awards disproportionately to the lower mainland. The First Nations that rely upon spotted kelp for traditional food sources are left out if their stocks are drying up in their areas, as well as just the decreased opportunity for young people to take up what was once a standard way of life in many of the coastal communities up and down the coast. And finally, just the actual process of decision making, many claim is just undemocratic and leaves out many stakeholders who feel that the consultation process is simply them talking to a wall. As long as the ultimate authority for rules rests with the minister and the DFO managers, they feel that the whole governance system is broken and leaves them out. Now, this is a diagram, some people refer to it as the Death Star, that demonstrates exactly how concentrated the licenses for herring fishing really are. Each of those little dots represents a herring fishing license. And that big pupil in the eye there is all owned by one company and its subsidiaries. And that's Jim Pattison Enterprises. So you can imagine why some of these smaller dots are a bit upset at the lack of opportunities that they have. Now, what we're doing to resolve this conflict, well, it's not necessarily an easy solution, but what I and my supervisors have been doing is trying to make what these disagreements are a little bit more explicit. We've been conducting interviews in Haida Gwaii and soon here in the Lower Mainland to make explicit what the values and the preferences of stakeholders are. This, we hope, will provide the managers with better data to inform their decisions and offer some insight as to how the stakeholders actually perceive the fishery and management process to be. So we developed a very novel methodology where we conducted 42 interviews in Haida Gwaii, presenting respondents with 12 values cards. These 6 came from a technical report by the Haida Oceans Technical Team, in which they identified traditional Haida values that resonated with modern resource management. These 6 came from a variety of literatures in sociology, moral psychology. All of these value cards were illustrated with artwork by April White, an artist who lives in Haida Gwaii. Now, we asked respondents to prioritize these values as they felt best resonated with their own values. And what we found was pretty consistent preference for respect and responsibility amongst the folks in Haida Gwaii. They felt that respect for non-humans especially, and stewardship as a responsibility resonated with them quite a bit. We also found that respondents favored much more conservative fishing regimes than are currently in effect. They favored either an abolishment of commercial fishing altogether or a restriction to only the commercial spawn on kelp. And almost a good majority also felt that the governance process itself was not democratic enough and wanted greater sovereignty over decision making, either through co-management with DFO or for full Haida control of the herring fisheries in Haida Gwaii waters. Now, to complement that information, the next step is to sit down with stakeholders here in the Lower Mainland, mostly commercial fishermen and industry players, and talk to them about their values, what their beliefs about the state of herring stocks are, and what they would like to see out of management. I'm really curious about whether their priorities for values will be all that different from the Haida Gwaii community members. And if so, whether any differences in their preferences for management are the result of these different value priorities, or if they stem from differences in beliefs about how the stock actually is doing, whether these stem from normative concerns that they have or from descriptive ones. So I'll be starting these interviews in the next few weeks, and if anyone has any contacts, I'd love to hear them. So finally, DFO is conducting their own process right now to try to make things a little better. They recognize that court injunctions and protest actions every year are not a very good way to run a fishery. So they've been sitting down and involving themselves with discussions with First Nations and other stakeholders on how to move forward with herring fisheries in BC. my group's research that we've been doing, we feel can complement and inform this discussion process by offering some very hard and very rich evidence as to what the stakeholders individually actually feel is important and what they want to see in the future. We feel that by separating that descriptive and normative side of the conflict and making explicit what these hidden assumptions are and considering all stakeholders' values, that this research can lead to a lasting collaborative solution to the herring conflict. Thanks. Any questions? Students first. Okay. Yeah, Hadi.
So Lynn and I have a question together.
Sure.
Maybe that'll count as a student.
Okay.
If you show your cards,
Mhm.
you actually show the cards with the art.
We do.
Have you tested the art separately from the card, the content of the card and the card separately from the art?
No, we have not. It's not.
That might be a problem.
It could be. However, the methodology was designed by my supervisor and colleagues to try to be to make it as culturally appealing to the target audience that we were investigating, to try to provide some sort of local context for what would otherwise be some very abstract ideas of justice and whatnot.
The question is that Ms. White,
Mhm.
in depicting the word in some picture,
Sure.
is creating a representative picture.
There's certainly that argument to be made. The most that we can say is that we are keeping that artwork consistent for all of our study participants, and we are asking them to elaborate on how they interpret the art as well as the value, and that does go into our qualitative analysis of the results.
You thought about using the art separately from the work, just see what people react to, you know, some artwork, what you see.
Sure. It means that, you know, ideally we would have to double our sample size, right, to have a control. And that's, at this point, just not feasible. But, sure. Johnny? Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, plan on delving
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Good question. The question for the tape was whether we're delving into how respondents interpret respect and responsibility and other values. And the answer is yes. We do ask them explicitly what each of these values that we present them mean to them, and I am getting into some of the qualitative coding of what sort of themes pop up over and over again when people describe what respect means to them or what responsibility means. And you do see a variety of interpretations. Most of them are pretty similar. A lot of the Haida Gwaii community members, even the non-Haida, hold very similar conceptions of respect and responsibility to the sort of official interpretation of respect and responsibility. And you notice too that a lot of people feel respect and responsibility are very broadly defined and encompass many other values and many other actions and prescriptions too. Yeah, Keith. Mhm. We will be using the same methodology, just for consistency and comparability. We'll be asking a few extra questions tacked on to the end that are more specific to the concerns of commercial fishers and industry players. You know, I'm really interested in how these concerns about distribution of benefits and industry consolidation of licenses, how those are seen by commercial fishers. And so I'll obviously be asking those questions that weren't necessarily posed to the Haida Gwaii community members. Sure. Mhm. We will be using the same imagery, simply to have a consistent and comparable data set. If you know, we could certainly erase some of the imagery or erase some of the Haida definitions or Haida translations of words, but we feel that that would hurt our ability to compare, even if it would, you know, provide a bit of a control if we were to take that away from some of the new respondents and test that, as you know, Hadi was asking. But at the end of the day, we are constrained by our sample size, and so we just kind of have to make everything consistent and comparable. Mm-hmm. Sure. Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah. No. But yeah, I mean, we're definitely aware of this issue of the potential of bias of these images and the Haida words and whatnot. But you know, it's something that I think we've decided to live with. Yeah. Ian. I wish. Yeah, it's just constrained by budget and time, and I've got to write a thesis soon. So. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so how we chose to how we chose our respondents in the Haida Gwaii interviews, that was actually very, very delicate. So my supervisor, they set up this whole project in conjunction with the Council of the Haida Nation, and were given a sort of short list of people that the council thought might be good interviewees. And from that, though, my supervisor snowballed a little bit, and there were a handful of interviewees that the council doesn't necessarily approve of us talking to. So there were some diplomatic issues that arose from our sample selection in terms of maintaining a good, diverse set of views that's representative of the community there, but also treading that line of what is sanctioned by our community partners, which were the Council of the Haida Nation, who had different ideas about what was a good sample. Mm-hmm. Anyone else? Go.
Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks.